Welcome back to Pastor Emily's Story Hour. We're reading Rilla of Ingleside by L.M. Montgomery. Chapter 9. Doc Has a Misadventure.
"The war will not be over before next spring now," said Dr. Blythe, when it became apparent that the long battle of the N had resulted in a stalemate. Rilla was murmuring, "Knit 4, purl 1," under her breath, and rocking the baby's cradle with one foot. Morgan disapproved of cradles for babies, but Susan did not, and it was worthwhile to make some slight sacrifice of principle to keep Susan in a good humor. She laid down her knitting for a moment and said, "Oh, how can we bear it so long?" then picked up her sock and went on. The Rilla of 2 months before would have rushed off to Rainbow Valley and cried. Miss Oliver sighed, and Mrs. Blythe clasped her hands for a moment. Then Susan said briskly, "Well, we must just gird up our loins and pitch in. Business as usual is England's motto, they tell me, Mrs. Doctor dear, and I have taken it for mine. I will remember that Kitchener is at the helm, and Joffer is doing very well for a Frenchman. I shall get that box of cake off to little Jem, and finish that pair of socks today likewise. A sock a day is my allowance. Even Cousin Sophia has taken to knitting, Mrs. Doctor dear, and it is a good thing, for she cannot think of quite so many doleful speeches to make when her hands are busy with her needles instead of being folded on her stomach. She thinks we will all be Germans this time next year, but I tell her it will take more than a year to make a German out of me. Do you know that Rick McAllister has enlisted, Mrs. Doctor dear? And they say Joe Milgrave would too, only he is afraid that if he does, Whiskers on the Moon will not let him have Miranda."
"Even Billy Andrews' boy is going, and Jane's only son, and Diana's little Jack," said Mrs. Blythe. "Priscilla's son has gone from Japan, and Stella's from Vancouver, and both the Reverend Joe's boys. Philippa writes that her boys went right away, not being afflicted with her indecision. Jem says that he thinks they will be leaving very soon now, and that he will not be able to get leave to come so far before they go, as they will have to start at a few hours' notice," said the doctor, passing the letter to his wife.
"That is not fair," said Susan indignantly. "Has Sir Sam Hughes no regard for our feelings? The idea of whisking that blessed boy away to Europe without letting us even have a last glimpse of him! If I were you, Doctor dear, I would write to the papers about it."
"Perhaps it is as well," said the disappointed mother. "I don't believe I could bear another parting from him. Oh, if only— No, I won't say it. Like Susan and Rilla," concluded Mrs. Blythe, achieving a laugh, "I am determined to be a heroine."
"You're all good stuff," said the doctor. "I'm proud of my womenfolk. Even Rilla here, my lily of the field, is running a Red Cross Society full blast and saving a little life for Canada. That's a good piece of work. Rilla, daughter of Anne, what are you going to call your war baby?"
"I'm waiting to hear from Jim Anderson," said Rilla. "He may want to name his own child."
But as the autumn weeks went by and no word came from Jim Anderson, who had never been heard from since he sailed from Halifax, and to whom the fate of wife and child seemed a matter of indifference, eventually Rilla decided to call the baby James, and Susan opined that Kitchener should be added thereto. So James Kitchener Anderson became the possessor of a name somewhat more imposing than himself. The Ingleside family promptly shortened it to Jims, but Susan obstinately called him Little Kitchener and nothing else. "Jims is no name for a Christian child, Mrs. Doctor dear," she said disapprovingly. "Cousin Sophia says it is too flippant, and for once I consider she utters sense, though I would not please her by openly agreeing with her. As for the child, he is beginning to look something like a baby, and I must admit that Rilla is wonderful with him, though I would not pamper pride by saying so to her face, Mrs. Doctor dear. I shall never, no, never forget the first sight I had of that infant, lying in that big soup tureen rolled up in dirty flannel. It is not often that Susan Baker is flabbergasted, but flabbergasted I was then, and that you may tie to. For one awful moment I thought my mind had given way, and I was seeing visions. Then thinks I, no, I never heard of anyone having a vision of a soup tureen, so it must be real at least, and I plucked up confidence. When I heard the doctor tell Rilla that she must take care of the baby, I thought he was joking, for I did not believe for a minute she would or could do it. But you see what has happened, and it is making a woman of her. When we have to do a thing, Mrs. Doctor dear, we can do it." Susan added another proof to this concluding dictum of hers one day in October. The doctor and his wife were away. Rilla was presiding over Jim's afternoon siesta upstairs, purling 4 and knitting 1 with ceaseless vim. Susan was sitting on the back veranda, shelling peas, and Cousin Sophia was helping her. Peace and tranquility brooded over the glen. The sky was fleeced over with silvery, shining clouds. Rainbow Valley lay in a soft autumnal haze of fairy purple. The maple grove was a burning bush of color, and the hedge of sweetbriar around the kitchen yard was a thing of wonder. It did not seem that strife could be in the world, and Susan's faithful heart was lulled into a brief forgetfulness, although she had lain awake most of the preceding night thinking of little Jem far out on the Atlantic, where the great fleet was carrying Canada's first army across the ocean. Even Cousin Sophia looked less melancholy than usual, and admitted that there was not much fault to be found in the day, although there was no doubt it was a weather breeder, and there would be an awful storm on its heels. "Things is too calm to last," she said. As if in confirmation of her assertion, a most unearthly din suddenly arose behind them. It was quite impossible to describe the confused medley of bangs and rattles and muffled shrieks and yowls that proceeded from the kitchen, accompanied by occasional crashes. Susan and Cousin Sophia stared at each other in dismay. "What on earth is broke loose in there?" gasped Cousin Sophia. "It must be that Hyde cat gone clean mad at last," muttered Susan. "I have always expected it." Rilla came flying out of the side door of the living room. "What has happened?" she demanded. "It is beyond me to say, but that possessed beast of yours is evidently at the bottom of it," said Susan. "Do not go near him, at least. I will open the door and peep in. There goes some more of my crockery! I have always said that the devil was in him, and that I will tie to." Susan opened the door and looked in. The floor was littered with fragments of broken dishes, for it seemed that the fatal tragedy had taken place on the long dresser where Susan's array of cooking bowls had been marshaled in shining state. Around the kitchen tore a frantic cat, with his head wedged tightly in an old salmon tin. Blindly he careered about with shrieks and profanity commingled, now banging the can madly against anything he encountered, now trying vainly to wrench it off with his paws. The sight was so funny that Rilla doubled up with laughter. Susan looked at her reproachfully. "I see nothing to laugh at. That beast has broken your ma's big blue mixing bowl that she brought from Green Gables when she was married. But the thing to consider now is how to get that can off Hyde's head." "Don't you dast go touching it!" exclaimed Cousin Sophia. "Shut up the kitchen and send for Albert." "I am not in the habit of sending for Albert during family difficulties," said Susan loftily. "That beast is in torment, and whatever my opinion of him may be, I cannot endure to see him suffering pain. You keep away, Rilla, for little Kitchener's sake, and I will see what I can do." Susan stalked undauntedly into the kitchen, seized an old storm coat of the doctor's, and after a wild pursuit and several fruitless dashes and pounces, managed to throw it over the cat and can. Then she proceeded to saw the can loose with a can opener, while Rilla held the squirming animal rolled in the coat. Anything like Doc's shrieks while the process was going on was never heard at Ingleside. Doc was a wrathful and indignant cat when he was freed. Evidently, he thought the whole thing was a put-up job to bring him low. He gave Susan a baleful glance by way of gratitude, and rushed out of the kitchen to take sanctuary in the jungle of the sweetbriar hedge, where he sulked for the rest of the day. Susan swept up her broken dishes grimly. "The Huns themselves couldn't have worked more havoc in here," she said bitterly. "Things have come to a pretty pass when an honest woman cannot leave her kitchen for a few minutes without a fiend of a cat rampaging through it with his head in a salmon can."
come back tomorrow for the next chapter.